Hey guys, tonight we're slipping into the shadowy world of medieval assassins and the surprisingly brutal reality behind those legendary killers. These mysterious figures may seem glamorous in our modern imagination, but their lives were filled with shocking hardships that would break even the most hardened person. From agonizing poison resistance training to constant paranoia, gruesome execution, if caught, to spiritual damnation, your modern sensibilities simply aren't equipped for life in this dangerous profession. Before we begin our journey through the dark underbelly of medieval assassination, if you enjoy these nighttime stories, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to join our growing community of history lovers. I'd also love to know where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's always wonderful to see our global family connecting through these stories. Now, go ahead and dim those lights, perhaps turn on a gentle fan for that soothing background noise, and settle in as we drift back together to a time when a single successful kill might cost you everything from your sanity to your mortal soul. When we think about medieval assassins, our minds often conjure romantic images heavily influenced by modern entertainment. We imagine silent, black-clad figures scaling castle walls, elite killers with a strict code of honor, or perhaps mysterious orders operating from mountain fortresses. But the historical reality of medieval assassination was far more brutal, messy, and psychologically devastating than these polished fantasies suggest. To understand why being a medieval assassin was truly dreadful, we first need to clear away these modern misconceptions. The term assassin itself comes from the Arabic hashin, originally referring to the Nazarius Milis, a specific religious sect active primarily during the Crusades period. Over time, the term broadened to encompass professional killers across medieval Europe and the Middle East. Unlike the organized guilds or brotherhoods depicted in games and films, most medieval assassins were desperate individuals driven by terrible circumstances into the darkest profession imaginable. Let's start by considering the practical reality of becoming an assassin in medieval times. Unlike today's world of specialized training facilities or secretive government programs, the path to becoming a medieval assassin was typically born of desperation rather than choice. Most commonly, these killers emerged from three main backgrounds. First, there were soldiers who had fallen on hard times, veterans of countless battles who found themselves without employment after a war ended or their lord was defeated. These men possessed the combat skills and psychological hardening necessary to kill, but lacked legitimate outlets for their abilities during peacetime. With families to feed and no pension system, some turned to murder for hire, leveraging the only marketable skill they had left. The second common background was that of the criminal underworld. In overcrowded medieval cities with extreme wealth inequality, criminal organizations flourished. Those who demonstrated a particular aptitude for violence might be groomed for assassination work, often beginning as enforcers or debt collectors before graduating to more lucrative contracted killings. Unlike the romanticized notion of the lone wolf assassin, these killers typically operated as part of broader criminal networks, with handlers who arranged contracts and provided some degree of protection. The third pathway came through political or religious extremism. The original assassins of the Nazarius Milis sect fall into this category, as do various agents employed by competing nobles, royals, or church factions throughout medieval Europe. These killers were motivated by ideology as much as money, believing their actions served a higher purpose, whether religious salvation or political necessity. Regardless of their background, all medieval assassins shared one devastating reality. They lived with the absolute certainty that their discovery meant not just death, but specifically a prolonged, agonizing public execution designed to maximize suffering. Medieval justice reserved its most creative and torturous punishments for those who committed murder by stealth, seeing such acts as particularly threatening to social order. Consider the psychological burden of knowing that if caught, you wouldn't simply be hanged. You might be broken on the wheel, your limbs systematically shattered with an iron hammer, your body woven through a large wooden wheel, and then left elevated to die slowly over days while birds pecked at your flesh. Or perhaps you'd face drawing and quartering, where you'd be dragged through streets, partially hanged, disemboweled alive, forced to watch your organs burned before your eyes, and then finally have your body torn into 4 pieces by horses pulling in different directions. The medieval mind viewed assassination as one of the most severe crimes possible, worse in many ways than ordinary murder, because it violated the natural order of society. Killing a social superior, especially by stealth rather than honorable combat, represented an inversion of the divinely ordained hierarchy. Consequently, the punishments were designed not just to kill the assassin, but to utterly erase them, to make their death so spectacular and horrifying that it would deter others and symbolically restore the social order they had disrupted. Living with this knowledge that every contract accepted might end not just in death, but in unimaginable torture, created immense psychological strain. Medieval assassins didn't have the luxury of modern psychological concepts like compartmentalization or therapy. Instead, many turned to coping mechanisms that further degraded their quality of life. Excessive drinking, use of various mind-altering substances, and increasingly reckless behavior stemming from fatalism. Beyond the legal consequences, medieval assassins also faced spiritual torment. In a time when religious belief was nearly universal and extraordinarily literal, the certainty of eternal damnation weighed heavily. The medieval Christian church was unequivocal about murder. It condemned the killer's soul to hell. For assassins operating in Christian territories, each contract fulfilled meant not just risking their life, but knowingly sacrificing their eternal soul. Many assassins employed by political figures would demand absolution as part of their payment, requiring their employers to arrange special indulgences or secret confessions to priests willing to overlook their deeds. But spiritual anxiety wasn't limited to Christian assassins. Those operating in Islamic territories faced similar religious prohibitions against murder, particularly killing fellow Muslims. Jewish assassins, though historically rarer due to smaller population sizes and different community structures, confronted their tradition's prohibitions against bloodshed. Across all medieval cultures, religious frameworks provided few psychological escape hatches for those who killed for money. Now let's consider the practical aspects of carrying out assassination contracts in medieval times. Unlike modern hitmen with access to firearms, surveillance technology, or easy escape routes, medieval assassins faced significantly greater physical risks with every assignment. Most killings had to be conducted at close range with daggers, garrotes, or poison, methods requiring intimate proximity to the target. The most common and reliable method, poison, presented its own horrific challenges. Effective poisons like arsenic, hemlock, or belladonna were difficult to obtain and dangerous to handle. Many assassins suffered chronic health problems or died from accidental exposure to their own toxins. Some accounts suggest that assassins would gradually expose themselves to small amounts of common poisons to build tolerance, a practice that, while offering some protection against accidental poisoning, led to accumulating toxic damage to their bodies over time. Poison presented another significant problem: unreliability. Without modern understanding of dosage, body weight calculations, or even basic chemistry, medieval poison assassinations frequently went wrong. Too small a dose might only sicken the target, alerting them to the attempt and leading to increased security. Too large a dose might cause such dramatic symptoms that poisoning was immediately suspected, triggering investigations that could expose the killer. The perfect poisoning, one that appeared to be natural illness, was extraordinarily difficult to achieve. Alternative methods carried their own risks. Daggers required getting dangerously close to the target, often requiring infiltration of secured spaces and offering limited escape options. Garrotes needed the element of complete surprise and sufficient strength to finish the job quickly. Accidents, botched attempts, or unexpected resistance from targets led to many assassins being captured in the act. Unlike their romanticized counterparts in fiction, real medieval assassins rarely had specialized equipment, extensive training in stealth techniques, or elaborate escape plans. Most operated with minimal resources resources, limited information about their targets, and under significant pressure from their employers. The majority of assassination attempts in medieval records were crude, messy affairs rather than the clinical precision strikes depicted in modern entertainment. This brings us to another grim reality. The success rate for medieval assassins was shockingly low compared to the risks taken. Historical records suggest that high-profile targets, nobles, clergy, wealthy merchants, survived the majority of assassination attempts against them. Successful assassinations make it into historical accounts precisely because they were exceptional, not because they were common. For the assassin, this math was devastating. Each failed attempt dramatically increased the likelihood of capture, torture, and execution, while successful assassinations often triggered intense manhunts that forced killers to flee their homes, abandon families, and live in constant fear of discovery. The most successful medieval assassins were those who managed to complete perhaps 2 or 3 contracts before being caught or killed, hardly the long, glamorous careers depicted in fiction. Employers of assassins understood this risk calculation perfectly and used it to their advantage. Payment structures typically offered minimal upfront compensation with the bulk promised upon successful completion, money that many assassins never lived to collect. Employers had every incentive to betray their killers after the deed was done, eliminating both the financial obligation and a dangerous witness to their conspiracy. This reality created a climate of extreme paranoia among medieval assassins. Those who survived their first few contracts learned to trust no one, constantly watching for signs of betrayal from their employers, potential recognition by witnesses, or the approach of authorities. Many developed elaborate routines to detect if they were being followed, maintained multiple hiding places, and lived in a state of perpetual readiness to flee. The psychological toll of this existence was enormous. Medieval medical texts don't describe post-traumatic stress disorder or anxiety disorders in modern terms, but accounts of killers for hire across various medieval sources repeatedly note symptoms we would now recognize as severe mental health deterioration: insomnia, paranoid ideation, self-medication with alcohol, outbursts of unprovoked violence, and in many cases, eventual suicide. This psychological deterioration was accelerated by the social isolation inherent to the profession. Unlike soldiers who killed in battle alongside comrades who shared the experience, assassins typically operated alone or in very small groups. They couldn't discuss their work, process their experiences with others, or build supportive relationships based on honesty. Their social circles were limited to criminal contacts who might betray them at any moment for the right price. Family relationships suffered particularly. Those assassins who attempted to maintain connections with spouses, children, or parents lived in constant fear that these loved ones might be targeted as leverage or punished in their stead if their profession was discovered. Many eventually cut ties completely, reasoning that total separation was the only way to protect family members, adding profound loneliness to their already significant psychological burdens. For those rare assassins who managed to survive long enough to retire from active killing, the future remained bleak. Without modern concepts like retirement savings or career transitions, aging assassins faced difficult prospects. Their specialized skills had no legitimate applications. Their bodies often suffered from the accumulated damage of poisons, wounds, and the physical toll of constant stress, and their minds bore the scars of years spent in hypervigilance and moral compromise. Many former assassins ended up as beggars in cities far from their origins, died from health complications related to their former profession, or were eventually recognized and executed for past crimes. The lucky ones might secure positions as guards or enforcers for criminal organizations, trading the acute dangers of assassination for the chronic risks of general criminal activity. Throughout medieval European and Middle Eastern sources, we find remarkably few accounts of assassins who lived long, prosperous lives after their killing days ended. This speaks to both the high mortality rate of active assassins and the limited options available to those who survived. The fictional trope of the wealthy retired assassin living in comfortable seclusion simply doesn't appear in historical records, because such outcomes were vanishingly rare, if they occurred at all. So far, we've examined the practical and psychological challenges facing generic medieval assassins across various cultures. But to truly understand why this profession was particularly dreadful, we should examine some specific examples from different regions and periods, each highlighting the unique horrors of assassination work within their cultural context. Let's first consider the original assassins, the Nizari Ismailis, operating primarily from their fortress at Alamut in the mountains of Persia during the 11th or 10th centuries. Contrary to modern myths, these assassins weren't paid mercenaries but religious devotees who believed their targeted killings of political and military leaders were sacred acts protecting their community from extinction. The training of these assassins involved indoctrination from an early age, with total devotion to their leader, the Old Man of the Mountain, and the cause. Young men selected for assassination work would be taught languages, customs, and mannerisms of enemy courts or camps they would infiltrate. They would spend years living undercover, sometimes gaining the trust of their eventual targets, all while maintaining absolute secrecy about their true purpose. This psychological burden was amplified by the near certainty of death. Unlike hired killers who might hope to escape after their deed, Nizari assassins rarely planned for survival. Their assignments typically involved killing high-profile targets in public settings, specifically to maximize symbolic impact, with little chance of escape afterward. They were, essentially, engaging in suicide missions, a fact they were well aware of throughout their years of preparation. Contemporary accounts from their enemies describe these assassins displaying unnerving calm when captured, often appearing almost relieved that their mission and life were concluding simultaneously. This suggests a level of psychological conditioning that modern psychiatry would consider deeply traumatic, effectively erasing natural survival instincts through religious indoctrination. While the Nizari Ismailis represent a highly organized and ideologically driven example of medieval assassination, a very different model existed in the Italian city-states during the later medieval and early Renaissance periods. Here, political assassination became almost institutionalized among competing noble families and political factions. Italian assassins of this period faced unique challenges. Operating in densely populated cities with complex political environments, they needed to navigate intricate webs of alliances, rivalries, and informants. Unlike the Nizari assassins who targeted clear enemies, Italian political killers often found themselves eliminating targets who were only temporary obstacles to their employers, meaning today's target could have been yesterday's ally. This created morally and practically confusing work environments. An assassin might be contracted to kill someone connected to their previous employer, raising questions about whether this new contract was actually a trap. The shifting political landscape meant that an assassination deemed necessary and justified one week might be considered a terrible mistake the next, leaving the killer exposed if political winds changed. The Italian context also introduced another dreadful aspect of medieval assassination: the use of assassins as scapegoats. Historical records from Florence, Venice, and other city-states reveal multiple instances where nobles deliberately hired assassins to eliminate rivals, then publicly discovered and executed these same assassins, presenting themselves as champions of justice while achieving both their original aim, eliminating the rival, and a secondary benefit, appearing tough on crime. This phenomenon became so common that experienced assassins in Italian contexts demanded extraordinary payment up front, knowing that post-assassination protection promises from employers were essentially worthless. This reality created a grim economic trap. The more experienced and successful an assassin became, the more they knew about the treacherous nature of their employers, and thus the more they charged, making it increasingly economical for those employers to betray them after a successful hit. Moving northward to medieval England and France, we find assassination taking on different characteristics, particularly in the context of the Hundred Years' War and internal power struggles among nobles. Here, assassins often operated in the shadows of legitimate military conflict, making the boundaries between warfare, murder, and assassination frequently unclear. English and French assassins of this period faced a particular moral and legal confusion. If they killed an enemy knight on the battlefield, they were honorable soldiers. If they killed the same knight in his bed the night before battle, they were dishonorable assassins deserving torture and execution. Yet their employers, often military commanders or nobles, increasingly saw strategic advantage in eliminating key enemy figures by any means necessary. This contradiction created situations where assassins might be secretly employed by the same lords who would publicly condemn assassination. Some killers were promised official protection, or even that their acts would be retroactively classified as legitimate wartime killings, only to find these promises worthless when political expediency required a scapegoat. In these Northern European contexts, we also find more examples of assassins drawn from the ranks of common soldiers or archers, men with combat skills but without the chivalric code or social standing of knights. For these individuals, assassination work offered financial opportunities far beyond their normal station, but at tremendous risk. Records of judicial proceedings show that captured assassins from lower social classes received particularly brutal punishments, serving as public examples to deter others from similar ambitions. In Eastern Europe and the Byzantine Empire, assassination took on additional dimensions of complexity due to the interface between competing religious and political powers. Assassins operating in these regions often found themselves navigating between Orthodox Christian, Catholic, and Islamic interests, sometimes being hired by one faction to eliminate members of another, only to become targets themselves when alliances shifted. Byzantine assassins in particular operated in an environment of elaborate court intrigue where poison was the predominant method. The close quarters of the Byzantine court, with its concentrated power and physical proximity of key figures, made poisoning both practical and extraordinarily risky. Detection meant not just execution, but often the elimination of the assassin's entire family or social network. This Eastern European and Byzantine context introduces another psychological burden unique to some medieval assassins: the reality of eliminating targets who had done nothing wrong beyond being born to the wrong family or supporting the wrong political faction. While all assassins faced moral complexities, those working within highly dynastic political systems often found themselves killing children, elderly family members, or others whose only crime was their bloodline, targets difficult to rationalize even for hardened killers. Across all these varied contexts, one common theme emerges: medieval assassination was not a path chosen by those with options. It represented the desperate end of a spectrum of survival choices, embraced only by those with the lethal skills and psychological capacity to kill but without legitimate outlets for those abilities. Far from the glamorous, wealthy contract killers of modern fiction, medieval assassins were typically broken individuals caught in systems that used and discarded them with brutal efficiency. The few first-hand accounts we have from medieval killers, typically recorded during torture or confession, paint consistently bleak pictures of lives dominated by fear, isolation, and the certainty of a bad end. Many express regret not specifically for their killings, but for entering a profession from which they found no escape, describing their career trajectory as a kind of living death, a one-way path with no possibility of redemption or return. The sense of being trapped, psychologically, spiritually, and practically, represents perhaps the most dreadful aspect of the medieval assassin's experience. Unlike nearly any other medieval profession, Assassination offered no community, no pride in craftsmanship, no potential for social advancement, and no possibility of old age spent reflecting on contributions to society or family. It was, by its nature, a dead end in every sense of the term. As we pause here in our exploration of medieval assassins' lives, consider how different this reality is from the romanticized versions we encounter in entertainment. There were no brotherhood creeds, no master assassins passing wisdom through generations, no hidden blades or specialized equipment, and certainly no retiring to peaceful villas with the fortunes earned from contracts. In the next part of our journey, we'll delve deeper into the specific methods medieval assassins employed, the physical toll these took on their bodies, and the increasingly sophisticated countermeasures developed by potential targets. We'll explore how food tasters, proto-security teams, and architectural designs evolved specifically to counter assassination threats, making the assassin's job progressively more dangerous over time. We'll also examine more closely the religious and cultural dimensions of medieval assassination, including how different societies viewed these killers and the spiritual punishments believed to await them. For now, rest easily unlike the perpetually vigilant assassins we've discussed, and know that we've only begun to uncover the surprisingly desperate and brutal reality behind one of history's most misrepresented professions. As we continue our exploration of why it was truly dreadful to be a medieval assassin, let's look more closely at the methods these killers employed and the physical toll these techniques took on their own bodies. Far from the elegant, clinical killings depicted in modern entertainment, medieval assassination was typically messy, unreliable, and extraordinarily dangerous for the assassin themselves. Poison was the most common method for several practical reasons. It offered the possibility of killing at a distance, potentially allowed the assassin to be elsewhere when the target died, and in some cases could mimic natural illness. However, working with medieval poisons created a nightmare of health complications for the assassins themselves. The most widely used poisons came from plants like monkshood, aconite, belladonna, and hemlock, or from minerals like arsenic and mercury compounds. Each presented significant dangers to the handler. Assassins frequently experienced symptoms of chronic poisoning themselves, as the crude preparation methods of the time led to skin absorption, accidental ingestion through contaminated hands, or inhalation of toxic dust. Medieval medical texts describe individuals suspected of being poisoners by their distinctive symptoms: trembling hands, patchy hair loss, persistent digestive issues, strange breath odors, and in many cases cognitive decline. Some assassins attempted to build immunity by consuming tiny amounts of their preferred poisons over time, a practice that offered limited protection but accelerated long-term organ damage. One particularly disturbing account from 13th century France describes a captured poisoner whose body was so saturated with arsenic that when executed by hanging, his corpse was refused burial because animals that fed on exposed bodies kept dying after consuming his flesh. While likely embellished, this story reflects the genuine biological accumulation of heavy metals in tissues after chronic exposure. The unreliability of poison created additional stress. Without standardized measurements or understanding of individual variations in resistance, assassins could never be certain of their dosage calculations. Too little poison meant failure and potential discovery. Too much meant obvious poisoning symptoms that would trigger investigations. The sweet spot of mimicking natural death was extraordinarily difficult to achieve. For those targeting highly placed individuals like nobles or wealthy merchants, additional complications arose in the form of food tasters and emerging poison detection methods. By the later medieval period, potential targets employed tasters who would sample food and drink before their masters consumed it. Some courts developed elaborate rituals around food service, specifically designed to prevent tampering, creating increasingly narrow windows for poison introduction. Certain courts and noble households employed crude poison detection devices like drinking vessels made of crystal unicorn horn, actually narwhal tusk, or special stones that were believed to change color or sweat in the presence of poison. While these had no actual chemical detection capabilities, they created psychological barriers and sometimes caught assassins through the power of suggestion. A nervous poisoner might react visibly when such devices were dramatically produced at a feast. When poison failed as an option, medieval assassins turned to direct physical methods, each with its own terrible risks. Daggers were the most common weapon, but using them required getting dangerously close to the target, often in situations where the assassin was physically outmatched or outnumbered by guards or companions. Those specializing in knife attacks developed specific techniques for ensuring rapid death while maximizing their own escape chances. Some accounts describe assassins practicing on animal carcasses or condemned prisoners for those working directly for authorities with access to dungeons to learn the most efficient strike locations. These practice sessions were psychologically traumatic in themselves, contributing to the overall burden of the profession. The physical danger of close-quarter assassination was extreme. Historical records consistently show that assassins attempting knife attacks had survival rates far worse than soldiers in battle. Even successful assassinations frequently ended with the killer's death moments later at the hands of guards or bystanders. Unlike the choreographed fight scenes of modern entertainment, medieval knife combat in confined spaces was chaotic, brutally quick, and offered minimal opportunity for the elegant escapes we see in fiction. A particularly specialized and dreaded assassination technique involved garrotes, thin wires, cords, or metal strands used to strangle targets. These required even greater proximity than daggers but offered the advantage of silence and in some cases could be disguised as jewelry or decorative items until the moment of use. Assassins who specialized in garrote techniques developed distinctive physical characteristics, unusually strong forearms and hands, often with deformed knuckles from the specific crushing grip required for effective strangulation. The psychological toll of garrote assassination was particularly severe. Unlike the relative distance of poisoning or the quick violence of a dagger, garrote killings forced the assassin to maintain close physical contact with their struggling victim for several minutes, feeling every desperate movement as life slowly extinguished. Medieval confessions from captured garrote specialists frequently mention recurring nightmares featuring the faces of their victims in their final moments, suggesting what we now recognize as severe PTSD. Some assassins employed more exotic methods for specific targets or situations. Crossbows offered the possibility of killing from a distance, though they were large, difficult to conceal, and complex to operate effectively. Specially designed hollow rings concealing small poison reservoirs could deliver lethal scratches during seemingly innocent physical contact. Poisoned needles hidden in written correspondence could prick unsuspecting readers. These specialized tools required considerable resources to create, meaning they were typically available only to assassins employed by wealthy and powerful interests, usually nobility, or in some cases the church. Most common assassins worked with far more primitive tools, increasing both their physical danger and the likelihood of failure. Beyond the dangers inherent to their methods, medieval assassins also contended with increasingly sophisticated countermeasures developed specifically to thwart them. By the 13th and 14th centuries, high-value targets had developed comprehensive security systems that made successful assassination extraordinarily difficult. Architectural innovations were specifically designed with assassination protection in mind. Spiral staircases in castles were intentionally constructed to wind clockwise going up, giving defenders, typically right-handed, the advantage of a wider arc for their swords, while attackers had their movements constrained by the central column. Sleeping chambers featured hidden compartments for guards, multiple false doors, and in some cases, primitive alarm systems using bells or tripwires. Potential targets developed elaborate personal security procedures. Food preparation protocols required multiple witnesses. Servants from different loyalty groups would be tasked with preparing different components of meals. Dedicated security personnel would continuously sample the target's drinks throughout an evening. Personal chambers would be secured with complex locking mechanisms requiring multiple keys held by different individuals. For assassins, these evolving countermeasures created a deadly arms race in which they were perpetually disadvantaged. Each failed assassination attempt within a region would trigger new security innovations, making subsequent attempts more dangerous. Unlike modern security systems with potentially hackable patterns, medieval countermeasures were often intentionally irregular and unpredictable, operating on the protective principle of confusion rather than standardization. This reality created an environment where assassins had to constantly develop new approaches while accumulating the physical and psychological damage of their profession. The career trajectory of most medieval assassins followed a grim pattern: initial successes using established methods, followed by increasingly desperate innovations as countermeasures evolved, culminating in eventual capture or death when their adaptations failed to keep pace with security developments. The physical toll of this work cannot be overstated. Beyond the dangers of their methods and tools, medieval assassins lived in a constant state of hypervigilance that created tremendous physiological stress. Modern medical science has demonstrated that sustained fight-or-flight responses lead to cardiovascular damage, immune suppression, and accelerated aging, all without the additional burdens of medieval living conditions. From surviving accounts, medieval assassins frequently exhibited symptoms consistent with what we now understand as chronic stress disorders, disrupted sleep patterns, digestive issues, heightened startle responses, and diminished cognitive function over time. The constant physiological activation of danger responses, coupled with the need to maintain outward composedness to avoid detection, created a physically devastating internal state. This physical deterioration was compounded by the reality that assassins rarely had access to proper medical care. Injuries sustained during assignments had to be treated secretly, often with limited supplies and knowledge. Infection was a constant danger, as were complications from improperly healed wounds. Unlike soldiers who might receive care from battlefield surgeons or guild members who could access community healers, assassins largely suffered in isolation. If we examine the socio-economic realities facing medieval assassins, their situation becomes even more clearly desperate. Payment structures were heavily weighted toward completion rather than attempt, creating situations where assassins might expend considerable resources, planning and initiating an assassination only to receive nothing when the attempt failed. This economic pressure pushed many toward increasingly reckless methods as their financial situations deteriorated. Successfully completed contracts brought their own economic dangers. Sudden wealth in medieval society drew immediate attention in communities where most people lived at subsistence levels. Assassins who visibly improved their living situations after a prominent death might as well have confessed publicly. This reality forced many to live well below their means, essentially unable to enjoy the primary benefit of their terrible profession. Some attempted to launder their payments by establishing small businesses or making purchases through intermediaries. But medieval economies lacked the complex financial instruments that make modern money laundering possible. The relatively small size of medieval communities meant that unusual financial activities were quickly noticed and remembered, particularly when they coincided with recent assassinations. For those rare assassins who accumulated significant wealth, the challenge of preserving it added another layer of stress. Banking systems were primitive, unreliable, and frequently tied to religious institutions that might have moral qualms about certain depositors. Physical storage of valuables required secure locations that wouldn't draw attention. Many resorted to burying their earnings, creating the very real risk that their wealth would be lost forever if they died unexpectedly, as so many in their profession did. The economic precarity of assassination work extended beyond the individual to affect any family connections. Spouses and children of discovered assassins typically lost everything: homes, possessions, and social standing. In many jurisdictions, the families of executed assassins were formally banished, forcing them into desperate circumstances with the permanent stain of association with a condemned killer. This reality created agonizing dilemmas for assassins with families. Complete separation offered the best protection for loved ones, but meant sacrificing the human connections that might make their terrible existence bearable. Maintaining these relationships while trying to hide the true nature of their work meant living in constant fear of discovery and its consequences for innocent family members. We find evidence of these impossible situations in judicial records, which occasionally document the testimonies of assassins' family members after their capture. These accounts consistently express shock and disbelief at the revealed profession, suggesting that many assassins maintained elaborate cover stories even with their closest relations. The psychological burden of this continuous deception, being unable to be honest with even a spouse or child, added yet another layer to the profession's toll. The spiritual dimension of medieval assassination work presented yet another aspect of dreadfulness, particularly in an era when religious belief was nearly universal and extraordinarily literal. Unlike modern secularized societies where moral questions might be personally negotiated, medieval assassins operated within religious frameworks that unambiguously condemned their actions. For Christian assassins, the situation was theologically clear and terrifying. The Church's position on murder for hire was unequivocal: it condemned the soul to hell. While ordinary soldiers might receive absolution for killing in sanctioned warfare, and even ordinary murderers might receive final confession and die in a state of grace, assassination was considered particularly damning because it combined murder with premeditation, deception, and greed. Some assassins attempted to manage this spiritual crisis through complex theological gymnastics. Historical records include cases of killers who meticulously avoided technically delivering the fatal blow, for instance, by poisoning food but having someone else serve it, or by creating situations where targets would predictably die without direct action. These attempts to create moral distance rarely provided genuine psychological relief and often made their methods more complex and failure-prone. Others sought special religious dispensations, particularly those working for powerful church or political figures. Some employers promised prearranged absolution as part of payment, claiming authority, sometimes legitimately, to secure indulgences or special confessional arrangements. The uncertainty of these promises, which might be withdrawn if politically expedient, created another layer of anxiety. Islamic assassins face similar religious condemnation with additional complexities in some contexts. The original Nizari Ismaili assassins operated within a specific theological framework that justified their targeted killings as necessary for community survival, effectively reframing assassination as a form of defensive warfare. However, this justification was specific to their particular sect and circumstances. Most Muslim assassins operating in other contexts faced the same religious condemnation as their Christian counterparts. Jewish assassins, while historically less common due to smaller community sizes and different power structures, confronted their tradition's strong prohibitions against bloodshed. Throughout medieval Jewish theological writing, the prohibition against murder is consistently emphasized as absolute, creating severe spiritual crises for any within this tradition who turn to assassination. Across all these religious contexts, the assassin faced the terrible certainty that their profession placed their immortal soul in peril. In an era when the afterlife was conceived in vivid literal terms, eternal torment in hell, specific punishments designed for specific sins, this spiritual burden was not abstract but immediately terrifying. Many assassins reported dreams and visions of their damnation, suggesting the profound psychological impact of this spiritual dimension. Some attempted to address this spiritual crisis through extreme religious devotion when not actively working. Records mention assassins who were extraordinarily generous to churches, attended services religiously, or engaged in severe penances during their off periods. These attempts at spiritual balancing rarely brought peace, instead creating a form of cognitive dissonance that added to psychological strain. The most psychologically devastating aspect of the medieval assassin's existence may have been the complete absence of honor or respect for their profession. Unlike soldiers who could take pride in defending their communities, or even ordinary criminals who might achieve a certain roguish status within underground cultures, assassins were universally reviled. This universal condemnation meant that assassins could never experience one of the most fundamental human needs, the respect of others. Their successes could never be openly acknowledged or celebrated. Their skills, however exceptional, were valuable only in contexts that required absolute secrecy. Their professional identities existed only in shadows, recognized exclusively through fear rather than admiration. This reality created a profound identity crisis, unique to the profession. Medieval society offered many paths to social recognition. Craft guilds celebrated skilled artisans. Religious orders acknowledged devoted members. Military service brought recognition of courage. Even merchants could achieve respect through success. Assassins alone practiced a trade that, even when executed with perfect skill, could only bring infamy if discovered. The absence of professional community intensified this isolation. Unlike blacksmiths, who could gather in guild halls, soldiers who shared camaraderie in barracks, or even thieves who might develop codes and hierarchies within criminal organizations, assassins necessarily operated alone or in extremely small groups. The nature of their work prohibited the formation of the supportive professional communities that characterized other medieval occupations. Without community validation or the possibility of pride in their work, medieval assassins experienced a profound form of alienation that modern psychology recognizes as deeply damaging to human well-being. Numerous studies have demonstrated that social recognition and the ability to take pride in one's work are fundamental to psychological health, both entirely unavailable to those in this profession. This alienation was compounded by the need to maintain cover identities. Many assassins posed as merchants, travelers, servants, or other unremarkable figures to move freely without arousing suspicion. These covers required constant performance, interactions with others that were wholly inauthentic, relationships built entirely on deception. The psychological term for this today is identity strain, the stress of continually presenting a false self while suppressing one's actual experiences and knowledge. For those who survived long enough to age out of active assassination work, the future held few promising options. With bodies damaged by both the physical dangers of their profession and the physiological effects of chronic stress, aging assassins faced declining capabilities with no legitimate outlet for their specialized knowledge. Some attempted to transition into advisory roles, offering security consultation to potential targets based on their intimate knowledge of assassination techniques. This dangerous pivot required carefully constructed cover stories, explaining their expertise and risked exposure if clients became suspicious. Others sought positions in urban guard forces or as personal bodyguards, using their understanding of killing methods to prevent the same, again requiring elaborate explanations for their specialized knowledge. Many simply disappeared, abandoning identities and locations associated with their past and attempting to establish new lives in distant regions. These transitions rarely succeeded fully. Medieval communities were suspicious of newcomers without clear histories or visible means of support. The psychological habits developed during assassination work, hypervigilance, social detachment, instinctive threat assessment, made normal integration nearly impossible. The few first-hand accounts we have from those who attempted to leave the profession describe a persistent sense of being haunted, both by memories of their actions and by the constant fear that former employers, associates, or the families of victims might locate them. This continuous anxiety prevented even former assassins from ever achieving the peace that made their terrible profession seem worthwhile in the first place. If we step back to consider the overall psychological experience of the medieval assassin, what emerges is a portrait of near constant misery, occasionally interrupted by brief periods of relief when immediate dangers temporarily receded. The fundamental human needs for safety, connection, meaning, and respect were systematically denied by the very nature of their profession. Their safety was perpetually compromised by both their methods and the consequences of discovery. Their connections were limited to transactional relationships characterized by mutual suspicion. Their meaning could only be found in activities universally condemned by their societies. Their desire for respect could never be fulfilled while their true work remained hidden, which it necessarily had to for their survival. This combination created what modern psychology would identify as ideal conditions for profound depression, anxiety, and other serious mental health consequences. In an era without any concept of psychological treatment or even basic understanding of mental health, these conditions went unrecognized and untreated, leaving assassins to manage overwhelming psychological distress with only the crudest coping mechanisms. The typical trajectory of a medieval assassin's career reflects this cumulative damage. Historical patterns suggest that most became less effective over time, taking increasingly desperate risks or developing self-sabotaging behaviors. Many eventually placed themselves in situations where capture or death was likely, suggesting a form of passive suicide driven by the unbearable weight of their existence. Even those who survived and successfully retired from active killing found little peace. The physiological damage of years spent in hypervigilance, the psychological consequences of isolation and identity strain, and the spiritual burden of their actions created a constellation of suffering that followed them long after their last contract. The dreadfulness of the medieval assassin's life extended beyond their own experience to affect entire communities. The fear of assassination created atmospheres of suspicion in courts, noble households, and centers of power. This suspicion corroded social trust, leading to elaborate security measures, obsessive testing of food and drink, and constant scrutiny of servants and associates. This communal fear occasionally erupted into wider violence. When high-profile assassinations occurred, authorities frequently arrested and tortured dozens or even hundreds of suspects, many with only tenuous connections to the victim or circumstantial behaviors that aroused suspicion. These dragnets rarely captured the actual assassin, but caused tremendous collateral suffering. In some cases, assassination fears led to broader ethnic or religious persecution. When rulers or prominent figures died under suspicious circumstances, minority communities often faced collective punishment based on little more than general suspicion or historical prejudice. Jewish communities in medieval Europe were particularly vulnerable to these reactions, facing violence or expulsion following high-profile deaths that had nothing to do with their communities. For the medieval assassin, the knowledge that their actions triggered such wider suffering added yet another layer to their moral burden. While they might rationalize individual targeted killings, the predictable wider consequences created moral complications that even the most hardened killers struggled to ignore. What emerges from this examination is a profession that offered virtually nothing beyond basic survival to those who practiced it, while systematically destroying their bodies, minds, social connections, and spiritual peace. The medieval assassin's existence was not just dangerous but comprehensively miserable in ways that transcended the mere risk of death. As we pause here to absorb these realities, consider how completely this historical truth contradicts the romanticized assassin of popular entertainment. The real medieval killer was not a sophisticated operative with specialized training and equipment, but a desperate individual making deadly compromises for short-term survival at the cost of everything that makes life worthwhile. In our next segment, we'll explore specific historical assassinations and their aftermath, examining both successful operations and failed attempts to understand the radically different outcomes for the killers involved. We'll look at how high-profile assassinations changed history while simultaneously destroying those who carried them out. We'll also examine the evolution of assassination as a political tool throughout the medieval period and how it shaped broader historical developments in unexpected ways. For now, rest easily in the knowledge that the dreadful existence of the medieval assassin is safely confined to history, a reality we can examine with historical curiosity rather than immediate fear. Now that we've examined the general conditions that made the medieval assassin's existence so dreadful, let's explore some specific historical assassinations that illustrate these realities in vivid detail. By looking at both successful operations and failed attempts, we can better understand the radically different outcomes for the killers involved and the broader historical impact of their actions. Perhaps the most famous political assassination of the early medieval period was the killing of Emperor Nikephoros II, focus of the Byzantine Empire in 969 CE. Nikephoros, a successful military commander who had claimed the throne through marriage to the Empress Theophano, was deeply unpopular with certain court factions for his austere policies and military focus. The assassination itself reveals much about both the methods and consequences of medieval political killing. The plot was orchestrated by the Empress herself, who had grown to despise her husband, in collaboration with her lover and Nikephoros' nephew, John Tzimiskes. This pattern, intimate betrayal combined with political motivation, was common in court assassinations, creating situations where targets were vulnerable precisely because they trusted those closest to them. On the night of December 10th, 969, Theophano secretly admitted John and a small group of conspirators into the imperial bedchamber in the great palace of Constantinople. Finding the emperor sleeping on the floor, he had taken to austere habits, including sleeping on a bearskin rather than a proper bed. The assassins attacked him directly. Nikephoros initially fought back but was quickly overwhelmed. The killing was brutally efficient. Multiple sword strikes ensured death before any alarm could be raised. What happened next illustrates the complex aftermath of even successful assassinations. While John Tzimiskes did indeed claim the throne as planned, his path was not straightforward. The Byzantine patriarch refused to crown him until he had done penance for the murder, forcing him to exile Theophano, his co-conspirator and lover, to prove his remorse. Many of the actual killers, the men who physically carried out the assassination, were executed by John himself within months, eliminating witnesses who might later prove troublesome. This pattern of betrayal reflects the disposable nature of medieval assassins in power politics. They were tools to be used and discarded, often literally eliminated, after serving their purpose. For those who physically carried out the killing of Nikephoros, success meant at most a few months of reward before their own execution at the hands of the very person who had employed them. Moving to Western Europe, the assassination of King Conrad I of Germany in 918 CE offers another illuminating case study. Though less famous than some later royal assassinations, Conrad's death demonstrates the blurred lines between assassination and warfare that characterized the early medieval period. Conrad, who ruled during a time of considerable unrest, had made numerous enemies among the powerful dukes of his realm. Historical sources disagree on the exact circumstances of his death, but the most detailed account suggests he was killed by a targeted arrow shot during a minor skirmish. Not random battlefield chance, but a deliberately planned elimination disguised as warfare. The archer responsible for this killing was reportedly acting under orders from one of Conrad's rivals. This man's fate perfectly illustrates the disposability of medieval assassins. Having successfully eliminated the king with a well-placed arrow, he was himself killed almost immediately afterward by his own employer. His death served multiple purposes: eliminating a dangerous witness, providing a convenient scapegoat when questions arose about the suspiciously precise arrow shot, and allowing his employer to performatively demonstrate loyalty to the crown by executing the rogue archer. For the assassin in this scenario, success meant immediate execution, with his name recorded only as a traitor and kingslayer. His family, if he had one, would have faced severe consequences: property seizure, possible exile, or worse. This complete erasure of identity, except as a villain, represents another dreadful aspect of the medieval assassin's fate. Even in success, they achieved only infamy or anonymous death. Perhaps the most notorious assassins of the medieval period were the Nizari Ismailis, whose activities were so significant that they gave us the very word assassin. One of their most famous operations was the killing of Conrad of Montferrat in 1192, just days before he was to be crowned King of Jerusalem. The assassination was carried out by two Nizari killers who had reportedly spent months infiltrating Conrad's circle by posing as Christian monks. On April 28, 1192, they approached Conrad in the narrow streets of Tyre and attacked him with daggers, inflicting fatal wounds before being captured. What happened next demonstrates the terrible fate awaiting even the most dedicated and skilled medieval assassins. One of the killers was killed immediately by Conrad's guards. The second was captured alive and subjected to extended torture to extract information about who had ordered the killing. Contemporary accounts describe horrific torture methods employed against this assassin before his eventual public execution. The political aftermath of this assassination reveals another dreadful aspect of the medieval assassin's role, becoming a pawn in larger political narratives beyond their control. Though the captured assassin allegedly claimed under torture that Richard I of England had ordered the killing, historians generally believe the Nizari were acting independently for their own political purposes. Nevertheless, the assassination became entangled in the complex politics of the Crusader states, with various factions using the murder to advance their own agendas by assigning blame to their enemies. For the assassins themselves, this mission represented the culmination of their training and purpose, a high-profile killing that would advance their sect's interests. Yet their individual experiences ended in immediate death and torture, their identities subsumed into conflicting political narratives, and their motives distorted by the very process that sought to expose them. Failed assassination attempts often resulted in even worse outcomes for the would-be killers. The attempted assassination of Emperor Frederick II in 1246 provides a particularly stark example. Frederick, Holy Roman Emperor and King of Sicily, survived when a plot to poison him was discovered through the confession of a conspirator. The aftermath was brutally comprehensive. Those directly involved in the poison plot were executed through various elaborate methods, including being flayed alive, forced to swallow molten lead, or dragged behind horses until dead. Their families were targeted regardless of actual involvement: wives imprisoned, children disinherited or killed, extended family members subjected to property seizure and banishment. This case illustrates the concept of collective punishment that frequently followed failed assassination attempts. Medieval justice operated on principles that included family and associative guilt, meaning anyone connected to the assassin could face consequences. For the medieval assassin, this reality created impossible moral calculations. Even if they were willing to risk their own life, their actions placed everyone they cared about in mortal danger. The assassination of Peter I of Castile in 1369 provides yet another window into the complex realities facing medieval killers. Peter, known as the Cruel to his enemies, was engaged in a civil war with his half-brother Henry of Trastamara. The actual killing occurred in a face-to-face confrontation during battle, blurring the line between assassination and warfare. According to accounts, Henry and his French ally Bertrand de Guesclin confronted Peter in a tent after a battle. What followed was a personal combat between the half-brothers that ended with Peter's death. This case demonstrates how medieval assassinations sometimes occurred in contexts that allowed perpetrators to frame their actions as honorable combat rather than murder, potentially escaping the worst social and spiritual consequences. For Henry, who became king after killing his brother, the assassination was politically successful but created lasting legitimacy problems. Throughout his reign, he faced challenges based on the manner of his accession. This pattern, where even successful political assassinations created lingering instability, helps explain why medieval powers often preferred more indirect methods, despite their lower success rates. Moving to a different region, the assassination of Mahmud of Ghaznī's vizier provides insight into the particularly dangerous world of court politics in medieval Islamic states. In 1031, the vizier Ali Abien il Arslan was killed by poison administered in his food during a court ceremony. The assassin, a servant with access to the food preparation area, had been paid by a rival court faction. What makes this case instructive is the fate of the assassin and his associates. According to Persian chronicles, the investigation following the death identified not just the servant who administered the poison, but 17 others connected to the plot. All were executed through various methods, with the actual poisoner saved for last so he could witness the deaths of all his accomplices before facing his own execution. This case highlights the particular vulnerability of those who served as the physical instruments of assassination rather than its planners. In medieval power structures, these individuals, typically from lower social classes, were the most expendable elements in assassination plots, considered worthy of the most exemplary punishments, while higher status conspirators sometimes escaped with lesser penalties or none at all. The assassination of Philip of Swabia, King of Germany, in 1208 demonstrates another common pattern in medieval political killings. Philip was murdered by Otto of Wittelsbach, a nobleman with a personal grievance after Philip reneged on a marriage promise involving Otto's niece. This killing happened in a private chamber, with Otto gaining access based on his status and previous relationship with the king. Otto's fate illustrates the consequences facing even high-status assassins. He fled immediately after the murder, but was hunted down and killed the following year by the imperial marshal. His head was thrown into the Danube, and his body was left unburied, treatments normally reserved for the lowest criminals. His family lost lands and status, and his castle was demolished completely. This case demonstrates how medieval justice made little distinction between high and low-born assassins when the victim was of sufficient status. The social contract of feudal hierarchy was considered so fundamentally violated by assassination that even noble killers could expect the same gruesome fate as common murderers, perhaps even worse, because they had betrayed not just an individual, the entire concept of proper social order. For assassins themselves, this reality created a dreadful logical trap. Their employers often had high social status, providing some measure of protection against the worst punishments. But the actual killers, regardless of their own background, could expect the full measure of medieval justice if caught. This dynamic incentivized employers to betray their instruments once the deed was done, eliminating witnesses while demonstrating their own distance from the plot. One of the most infamous and well-documented assassinations of the later medieval period was the killing of Duke Louis I of Orleans in 1407 in Paris. Louis, the brother of the mentally unstable King Charles VI of France, was attacked at night by masked men while returning from a royal dinner. The assassins struck with swords, literally hacking off his hand when he raised it defensively, before delivering multiple fatal wounds. The aftermath of this killing provides particularly valuable insights into the political dimensions of medieval assassination. The murder was quickly traced to John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy, Louis's cousin and political rival. Rather than deny involvement, John eventually admitted to ordering the assassination, but claimed it was a justifiable tyrannicide because of Louis's alleged corruption and abuse of power. What followed was a remarkable public defense of assassination as a political tool. John commissioned the theologian Jean Petit to develop a formal justification for political killing. Petit's argument, presented to the Royal Council in 1408, defended the assassination on 7 grounds, essentially claiming that killing a tyrant without legal process was justifiable under certain circumstances. This public defense represents a relatively rare attempt to establish assassination as a legitimate political action, rather than a universally condemned crime. The response from authorities is equally instructive. Petit's arguments were condemned by the University of Paris and later by the Council of Constance, reaffirming the general medieval position that assassination remained outside acceptable political action, regardless of justification. For actual assassins, this philosophical debate had little practical impact. Even while John the Fearless was publicly defending the concept of justified assassination, the men who had physically carried out the murder of Louis were being hunted down. Those captured faced execution, regardless of their employers' attempts to frame the killing as legitimate political action. This disconnect between theoretical debates about justifiable tyrannicide and the practical treatment of actual assassins underscores another dreadful aspect of the medieval assassin's existence. They operated in a context where their actions might be secretly desired and even publicly defended by powerful figures, yet they themselves remained universally condemned and subject to the harshest punishments. The later medieval period saw assassination evolve in response to changing political structures and improved security around potential targets. The killing of Galazzo Maria Sforza, Duke of Milan, in 1476 demonstrates this evolution, while highlighting persistent realities for the assassins themselves. Sforza was killed during High Mass on December 26, 1476, in the Church of Santo Stefano in Milan. His assassins were 3 men, Giovanni Andrea Lampugnani, Carlo Visconti, and Girolamo Olgiati, who had conspired based on a mixture of personal grievances, political idealism inspired by classical republicanism, and opposition to Sforza's tyrannical tendencies. The killing itself was carefully planned to overcome the Duke's security. Choosing the crowded church during an important religious service provided both access and initial confusion. The assassins positioned themselves to approach from different directions, ensuring that even if one was stopped, others might succeed. When they struck, they used daggers to inflict multiple wounds almost simultaneously, overwhelming the Duke's personal guards through surprise and coordination. However, the aftermath demonstrates that even careful planning rarely secured escape for medieval assassins. Lampugnani was killed immediately by the Duke's guards. Visconti and Olgiati managed to flee initially, but were captured within days. Both were subjected to torture before being publicly executed through methods designed to maximize suffering and serve as warnings to others. Olgiati's final statement before execution has been preserved, offering rare insight into the mind of a medieval assassin. He reportedly declared, "Death is bitter, but fame is eternal," suggesting he viewed his action as justified tyrannicide that would bring lasting honor despite his terrible end. This perspective, assassination as a form of political martyrdom, represents another way some medieval killers attempted to find meaning in actions their societies universally condemned. Yet this search for meaning through political justification rarely provided genuine comfort in the face of medieval execution methods. Olgiati was tortured, publicly mutilated, and finally executed, his philosophical justifications doing nothing to mitigate his physical suffering or alter society's judgment of his actions. What can we learn from these specific historical assassinations about the overall experience of medieval killers? Several patterns emerge consistently across different regions and periods. First, even successful assassins rarely escape terrible consequences. The brief period between completing a contract and facing justice might span months or occasionally years, but historical records contain vanishingly few examples of assassins who lived long, comfortable lives after their deeds. The most common pattern was betrayal by employers seeking to eliminate witnesses and performatively distance themselves from the killing. Second, medieval justice made few distinctions between types of assassins when applying punishment, whether politically motivated, acting from personal grievance, or hired for payment. All faced similarly gruesome ends if captured. While their motivations might be recorded differently by chroniclers, their physical treatment by authorities remained consistently brutal. Third, assassination created wider circles of suffering beyond the killer themselves. Family members, associates, and sometimes entire communities faced consequences for the actions of individual assassins. This collective punishment aspect made assassination a particularly terrible choice for anyone who valued people beyond themselves. Fourth, the philosophical or political justifications occasionally developed for assassination did nothing to improve the practical treatment of the actual killers. While intellectuals might debate concepts like tyrannicide in abstract terms, these debates never translated into mercy or understanding for those who physically carried out such acts. Finally, the historical record suggests that most medieval assassins acted from positions of extreme vulnerability rather than power or choice. The decision to become an assassin typically followed the exhaustion of other options, representing a desperate attempt to survive in social systems that offered limited legitimate paths for many individuals. For the medieval person contemplating assassination as a profession, these historical examples would have provided stark warning about the likely trajectory of such a choice. Even the most carefully planned and successfully executed assassination typically led to death, if not immediate, then delayed, but virtually certain. The path of the assassin was in almost all cases a path to the execution ground, with only the timeline in question. Beyond the physical consequences, these historical cases also illuminate the intense isolation facing medieval assassins. Unlike most medieval professions which operated within community structures that provided both practical support and social identity, assassination was fundamentally solitary. Even when multiple killers cooperated on a specific operation, as in the Sforza assassination, their alliance was typically temporary and limited rather than forming a genuine community of practice. This isolation had profound psychological implications. Medieval society was structured around collective identities, guild membership, village affiliation, religious community, feudal relationships that provided individuals with both practical security and existential meaning. The assassin, operating outside all these structures, faced not just physical danger, but a form of social death that preceded their likely physical end. Some attempted to mitigate this isolation by maintaining cover identities within legitimate communities, but this strategy created its own psychological burdens. Living constantly in disguise, unable to speak honestly about experiences or form genuine connections, created what modern psychology would identify as severe identity strain, an exhausting condition of perpetual performance without authentic expression. The religious dimension of medieval assassination, briefly touched on in our previous segments, becomes even more apparent when examining specific historical cases. Across different cultures and periods, we find assassins attempting to reconcile their actions with religious frameworks that universally condemn them. Some, like the Nazarius Malis, operated within specialized theological interpretations that justified their killings as necessary for community defense. Others, like the killers of Louis of Orléans, attempted to frame their actions as justified tyrannicide, a concept tentatively explored by some medieval theologians, but almost never applied to legitimate actual assassinations in practice. The most common pattern, however, was a form of compartmentalization, assassins who remained religiously observant, while temporarily suspending their spiritual concerns during the actual planning and execution of killings. This psychological splitting created enormous internal tension, evident in the recorded confessions of captured assassins who often expressed acute awareness of the divine punishment they believed awaited them. This spiritual dimension added a uniquely medieval form of suffering to the assassin's burden. In an era when belief in eternal punishment was literal and vivid, the certainty of damnation created a profound form of anticipatory suffering beyond the physical dangers of the profession. Medieval assassins didn't just risk death, but eternal torment, a prospect that created a particularly acute form of psychological distress for those raised in deeply religious contexts. Some historical records suggest this spiritual anxiety actually increased over the course of an assassin's career. Initial killings might be rationalized through necessity or distance from the act itself, but as the death count rose, the weight of accumulated spiritual transgression became increasingly difficult to bear. This pattern helps explain why many long-active assassins eventually displayed behaviors suggesting death-seeking or self-sabotage. The psychological and spiritual burden became literally unbearable. The historical evolution of assassination methods through the medieval period reveals another source of dreadfulness. The profession required constant adaptation to survive, creating perpetual insecurity and stress. Early medieval assassinations often relied on relatively simple approaches, direct dagger attacks or basic poisons. As potential targets developed countermeasures, assassins were forced to develop increasingly complex methods, each carrying new risks and complications. By the late medieval period, successful assassinations of high-status targets typically required elaborate planning, specialized tools, and approaches tailored to circumvent specific security measures. This evolution created a sort of arms race in which assassins were perpetually disadvantaged. A security innovation could be implemented quickly across a lord's household or court, while assassins had to discover and adapt to these changes through dangerous trial and error, often fatal for those who failed to adapt quickly enough. This dynamic helps explain why many historically documented assassins show declining effectiveness over time. The constant pressure to develop new approaches created cumulative stress that affected performance, while the increasing complexity of required methods multiplied the potential failure points in any given operation. The assassin's career typically followed a trajectory of initial successes, followed by increasingly desperate innovations and eventually fatal failure. Perhaps the most consistently documented psychological characteristic of medieval assassins across historical cases is paranoia, an excessive but not irrational fear of betrayal and discovery that grew more intense with each completed contract. This paranoia was grounded in very real dangers. Employers who eliminated assassins after successful operations, former targets' families seeking revenge, authorities conducting investigations, religious figures pursuing spiritual justice. The practical manifestations of this paranoia created additional daily suffering. Many documented assassins developed elaborate security rituals, never sleeping in the same location twice, checking food and drink obsessively, maintaining multiple escape routes, trusting no one completely. These practices offered limited actual protection while significantly degrading quality of life, creating a state of perpetual hypervigilance that modern medicine recognizes as physically and psychologically damaging. Some historical accounts describe assassins who eventually became effectively incapacitated by their own security measures, unable to act effectively because every potential action was seen through the lens of maximum risk. This paranoid paralysis represents another way the profession eventually destroyed even those it didn't directly kill, rendering them incapable of normal function even when not actively engaged in assassination work. The economic realities of medieval assassination, briefly addressed in our previous segment, become clearer when examining specific historical cases. While popular imagination often associates assassins with significant wealth, the historical record suggests most operated in conditions of perpetual financial precarity, with payment structures heavily weighted against their interests. Typical contract structures offered minimal advance payment, enough to cover immediate expenses but not to compensate for the significant risks involved. The majority of payment came upon successful completion, creating a situation where assassins bore most of the risk, while employers maintained significant leverage. Failed attempts meant not just potential capture but also financial ruin, as the resources invested in planning and preparation were lost without compensation. Even when contracts were successfully completed, collecting payment often proved dangerous or impossible. Historical records contain numerous accounts of assassins killed immediately after completing their assignments, removing both the witness and the financial obligation simultaneously. Others received partial payment accompanied by threats should they seek the remainder, leveraging the assassin's necessary secrecy against them. Those who did receive full payment faced immediate new dangers. Sudden unexplained wealth in medieval communities attracted immediate attention. Spending patterns inconsistent with visible income raised suspicion, particularly when they coincided with recent unexplained deaths. This reality forced many successful assassins to live well below their means or develop elaborate cover stories to explain their improved circumstances. The combination of unreliable payment and difficulty using any wealth obtained created a situation where even financially successful assassins rarely achieved lasting security or comfort. The profession offered the theoretical possibility of significant payment without the practical ability to safely enjoy its benefits, another way in which it promised more than it delivered to those desperate enough to pursue it. As we approach the conclusion of this segment, let's consider one final aspect of the medieval assassin's dreadful existence: the absence of social legacy. Most professions in medieval society offered some form of lasting impact or remembrance: craftsmen through their created works, soldiers through battle stories or monuments, merchants through family businesses, scholars through writings, even farmers through cultivated lands passed to descendants. Assassins alone worked toward deliberate historical erasure. Success meant avoiding all historical record, with their deeds either attributed to natural causes or assigned to convenient scapegoats. Their skills could not be openly taught to apprentices or celebrated through guilds. Their accomplishments, such as they were, could never be acknowledged publicly or remembered accurately. This absence of legacy created a profound form of existential emptiness. Medieval society placed tremendous importance on remembrance through prayer for the dead, maintenance of family names, guild histories, and community memory. To be completely forgotten, or worse, remembered only as a reviled criminal, represented a fate many medieval people considered worse than death itself. For the medieval assassin, this social death preceded and extended beyond physical death. Their existence became a form of non-being, active in the world but unacknowledged, skilled but uncredited, consequential but unrecorded except as a cautionary tale or villain. This profound social erasure may represent the most uniquely dreadful aspect of their existence, touching on fundamental human needs for meaning and remembrance that transcend particular historical periods. As we pause here to absorb these specific historical realities, the comprehensive misery of the medieval assassin's existence becomes increasingly clear. They operated within systems designed to extract maximum utility from them while ensuring they bore all risks and received minimal rewards. Their physical danger was matched by spiritual torment, psychological isolation, and ultimate historical erasure. In our next segment, we'll explore how the role of the assassin evolved through different phases of the medieval period, from the early Middle Ages through the transition to the Renaissance. We'll examine how technological and social changes affected assassination methods and outcomes, and how different regional traditions of assassination developed distinct characteristics. We'll also consider how the experience of women assassins differed from their male counterparts, exploring the gender-specific challenges and techniques that emerged in this already dreadful profession. For now, rest comfortably knowing that the medieval assassin's fate caught between powerful employers, vigilant targets, and universal condemnation remains safely in the historical past, a cautionary tale rather than a contemporary reality. As we continue our exploration of why it was truly dreadful to be a medieval assassin, let's examine how this notorious profession evolved throughout different phases of the medieval period. The experience of assassins changed significantly from the early Middle Ages, roughly 500, 1000 CE, through the High Middle Ages, 1000 to 1300 CE, and into the late medieval period, 1300 to 1500 CE. Understanding these changes provides deeper insight into the consistently terrible but evolving conditions these individuals faced in the early medieval period. Assassination as a specialized profession barely existed in the form we might recognize. The political landscape of post-Roman Europe was characterized by relatively straightforward power dynamics, where violence frequently occurred openly rather than through stealth. During this period, most killings we might retrospectively categorize as assassinations were carried out by individuals already embedded within power structures, household guards, close relatives, or direct subordinates who had legitimate access to their targets. The Byzantine Empire represents a partial exception to this pattern. The complex court politics of Constantinople created conditions where specialized killers sometimes emerged, particularly in connection with imperial succession disputes. However, even in this context, most assassinations were conducted by individuals with official positions who abused their access rather than dedicated professionals hired specifically for killing. For those who did kill by stealth during this early period, the experience was dominated by immediate physical risks rather than the more complex psychological and social dimensions that would characterize later assassins. Without established tradecraft or specialized knowledge to draw upon, these killers relied on basic approaches, direct knife attacks, simple poisons, or orchestrated accidents that offered minimal chances for escape or deniability. The historical record suggests these early medieval killers rarely survived long after their actions without developed criminal networks to provide hiding places, specialized knowledge of disguise techniques, or established escape routes. Capture was nearly inevitable. Once caught, punishment was straightforward and brutal, typically immediate execution, without the elaborate torture methods that would develop in later periods. For the early medieval assassin, dreadfulness stemmed primarily from the virtual certainty of death following their actions. While they were spared some of the more complex psychological torments of later periods, this came with a significantly higher mortality rate. Almost none survived to face the long-term consequences of their profession. Most died within days or even hours of their killings. The transition to the High Middle Ages brought significant changes to the assassin's experience. During this period, roughly 1000 to 1300 CE, several developments created conditions for more specialized assassination work. The growth of complex urban environments provided both cover and opportunity. The increasing sophistication of political systems, particularly in Italian city-states and the Byzantine Empire, created demand for deniable violence. The Crusades created unprecedented contact between Western European and Middle Eastern traditions of covert killing, leading to exchange of techniques and approaches. This period saw the emergence of what we might recognize as professional assassins, individuals who specialized in killing for payment rather than due to personal involvement in political disputes. The most famous example, of course, is the Nizari Ismailis, the original assassins, but similar specialists emerged across Europe, particularly in Italian cities where factional conflict created consistent demand for their services. For these high medieval assassins, the profession became more developed but no less dreadful. The increased specialization brought new methods and techniques that marginally improved survival chances, but these came with new psychological and spiritual burdens. As assassination became recognized as a distinct category of killing, both religious and secular authorities developed specific responses, including more elaborate punishments designed specifically for such killers. This period also saw the emergence of more complex economic arrangements around assassination. Rather than the direct payment model of earlier periods, assassins might now work through intermediaries who arranged contracts, provided tools or poison, and offered limited protection. While these arrangements created a buffer between killer and employer, they also introduced new opportunities for betrayal, with intermediaries frequently sacrificing assassins to protect themselves or their more valuable clients. The material conditions of high medieval assassins varied widely but were generally poor compared to the romantic image later created around them. Few managed to accumulate significant wealth, as payment structures remained heavily weighted toward completion rather than initiation. Those who did successfully complete multiple contracts and collect payment faced the increasingly difficult challenge of using their wealth without attracting attention in more developed urban economies where unexplained prosperity raised immediate suspicion. One key development during this period was the increasing sophistication of poison use. While early medieval poisoners relied on crude preparations of naturally occurring toxins, the high medieval period saw development of more complex compounds, often drawing on knowledge preserved and expanded in Islamic medical and alchemical traditions. These advanced poisons offered greater reliability and sometimes mimicked natural illness more effectively, but they also created new dangers for the poisoners themselves. Contemporary medical writings from this period describe distinctive symptoms among individuals suspected of being poisoners: tremors, skin conditions, neurological issues, and gradually accumulating organ damage. The crude handling methods of the time meant that assassins absorbed small amounts of the poisons they worked with, leading to chronic conditions that often served as identifying markers for authorities suspicious of particular individuals. By the late medieval period, roughly 1300 to 1500 CE, assassination had developed distinct regional traditions with different characteristics. Italian assassination evolved into an almost institutional feature of city-state politics, with relatively standardized practices and payment structures. In the Byzantine Empire and parts of Eastern Europe, court assassination reached its highest sophistication, with complex poisoning methods predominating. In Western European kingdoms, assassination remained less organized but became increasingly entwined with emerging concepts of political resistance and tyrannicide. For assassins operating during this late period, the profession's dreadfulness took on new dimensions. By now, potential targets had developed increasingly sophisticated countermeasures. Food tasters became standard for important figures. Architectural security features were designed specifically to prevent unauthorized access. Early surveillance systems using networks of informants helped identify suspicious newcomers in urban centers. These developments created a paradoxical situation as assassination methods became more sophisticated. Their effectiveness actually decreased against high-value targets. The most protected individuals became nearly impossible to reach except by those already within their inner circles. This pushed professional assassins toward either increasingly desperate methods with lower success rates or toward targeting less protected individuals with less payoff, both representing deteriorating professional conditions. This late medieval period also saw increasing specialization among assassins themselves. Rather than general killers employing whatever method presented itself, many became specialists in particular techniques. Some focused exclusively on poison, developing expertise in specific compounds and delivery methods. Others specialized in disguise and infiltration, gaining access to otherwise secured locations. Still others developed particular skills with specific weapons optimized for quick, quiet killing. This specialization offered marginal improvements in effectiveness but created new vulnerabilities. Specialists became recognizable by their methods, making pattern identification by authorities easier. When forced to operate outside their specialized approach, their success rates dropped dramatically, and the deeper knowledge required for specialization meant longer training periods during which the aspiring assassin was particularly vulnerable to discovery or betrayal. Throughout all these periods, one consistent factor made the assassin's existence particularly dreadful: the asymmetry between their individual circumstances and the institutional powers arrayed against them. A single assassin, or even a small group, faced opposition from entire political, religious, and social structures designed specifically to prevent their success and ensure their destruction. This fundamental power imbalance created a professional environment unique in its hopelessness. Unlike almost any other medieval profession, assassination offered no path to security, respect, or stability. Each success actually increased the assassin's danger by adding to the resources devoted to their capture, while simultaneously reducing their own options through increased recognition risk. One fascinating but terrifying aspect of the medieval assassin's experience was their frequent use as political scapegoats, blamed for deaths they had nothing to do with. Historical records contain numerous instances where natural deaths or killings conducted by powerful figures were publicly attributed to unknown assassins to serve political narratives. These fictional assassins were then identified in the form of convenient marginal individuals who were executed to complete the deception. This dynamic created a terrible situation where even individuals who had never committed assassination might be condemned as assassins if they fit certain profiles or found themselves in vulnerable positions when a powerful figure needed a scapegoat. The mere existence of the assassin as a recognized social category created danger for anyone who could plausibly be assigned to that category, further cementing its status as one of the most dangerous possible identities in medieval society. Let's now turn our attention to a frequently overlooked aspect of medieval assassination: the experience of women who engaged in this already dreadful profession. While historical records identify fewer female than male assassins, those who do appear in the sources faced unique challenges and sometimes employed gender-specific methods that created distinct professional experiences. The most common pathway for women into assassination work was through positions allowing proximity to targets, while minimizing suspicion. Ladies-in-waiting, household servants, food preparers, and midwives or healers all had opportunities to harm those in their care, while maintaining an appearance of fulfilling their expected roles. This embedded approach differed from the more direct methods often employed by male assassins and created different risk profiles and psychological experiences. Poison was disproportionately associated with female assassins for both practical and cultural reasons. Practically, women often had legitimate access to food preparation areas without raising suspicion, making poison delivery straightforward. Culturally, medieval gender frameworks associated women with subtle rather than direct violence, creating both advantages and disadvantages for female poisoners. The advantage lay in reduced initial suspicion. A male newcomer showing interest in a noble's food preparation might raise immediate concerns, while a female servant in the same role appeared to be fulfilling normal gender expectations. The disadvantage emerged after poison was suspected, at which point investigation often focused immediately on female household members based on cultural assumptions about women's methods. This gender dynamic created a distressing double bind for female assassins. Their gender provided initial cover that improved chances of poison delivery, but virtually ensured they would be first suspected when poisoning was discovered. Historical judicial records show that women accused of poisoning faced particularly severe investigative methods and punishments, reflecting medieval concerns about unnatural violence that violated gender expectations. Beyond poison, Female assassins sometimes employed methods that exploited gender expectations in different ways. Some historical cases document women who gained assassination access by feigning romantic or sexual interest in targets, creating opportunities for close physical proximity that would be denied to male killers. Others used disguises as religious figures, nuns or female pilgrims, who would be permitted to approach high-status individuals in contexts where male strangers would be immediately challenged. These gender-specific methods created unique psychological burdens beyond those already inherent to assassination work. Female assassins often had to maintain complex performances conforming to gender expectations, while simultaneously preparing to violate the most fundamental of those expectations through acts of violence. This form of double performance created levels of identity strain even beyond those experienced by their male counterparts. The consequences of discovery were particularly terrible for female assassins. Medieval justice systems, which treated all assassins harshly, reserved special condemnation for women who killed by stealth. Such actions represented not just murder, but a fundamental transgression of natural order as understood through medieval gender frameworks. Punishment often included specific elements designed to highlight this gender transgression, adding humiliation to the already terrible physical torments facing all discovered assassins. Female assassins also faced greater challenges in establishing necessary professional connections. The criminal networks that sometimes provided male assassins with contracts, tools, and limited protection were largely closed to women, or accessible only through male intermediaries who demanded compensation beyond the standard fees. This structural disadvantage meant female assassins typically received less payment for equal risk while facing additional dangers from the very networks supposedly supporting their work. The historical record suggests women more frequently became assassins through coercion rather than choice, compared to their male counterparts. Court documents contain numerous cases where female poisoners testified that male relatives or authority figures forced their participation through threats. While such claims might sometimes represent defensive strategies during interrogation, the frequency of this pattern suggests a genuine gender difference in pathways to assassination work. This coercive entry created yet another psychological burden. While all assassins faced moral and spiritual concerns about their actions, those forced into the role experienced additional trauma from their lack of agency. The combination of forced violence and inevitable punishment created a particularly hopeless psychological position, with neither the present nor future offering any possibility of escape or redemption. Despite these additional challenges, some female assassins achieved significant success within the terrible metrics of their profession. Historical records document women who conducted multiple poisonings before discovery, some who successfully eliminated high-profile targets, and a few who managed to escape justice through carefully constructed alibis or strategic alliances. However, even these successful cases typically ended in eventual discovery and punishment, following the same general pattern as male assassins. For both male and female assassins across all periods, one consistent factor in their dreadful existence was their utility as cautionary examples. Medieval authorities understood execution not just as punishment, but as communication, a dramatic demonstration of consequences awaiting those who might consider similar crimes. Assassins, representing particularly threatening violations of social order, received especially public and theatrical punishments designed to imprint on community memory. This judicial theater created a situation where even the assassin's death became not their own. Their final moments were choreographed to serve social purposes beyond their control, their suffering calibrated for maximum audience impact, their last words often drowned out by official pronouncements about the nature and significance of their crimes. This final alienation, the transformation of even their death into a performance serving the very authorities they had often acted against, represents a particularly bitter aspect of the medieval assassin's fate. the emerging legal frameworks of the later medieval period created another dimension of dreadfulness for assassins. As kingdoms and city-states developed more sophisticated legal systems, assassination became subject to increasingly specific prohibitions with carefully calibrated punishments. These legal innovations didn't reduce the severity of consequences, but made them more predictable and systematic, eliminating the small hope of exceptional treatment that might exist in less formalized systems. By the 14th and 15th centuries, many European jurisdictions had established specific legal categories for different types of killing, with assassination, murder by stealth, or treachery invariably placed in the most severely punished category. These legal innovations reflected growing state power and administrative sophistication rather than any humanitarian evolution. The punishments remained extreme, but now came through bureaucratic processes rather than immediate reaction. For the assassin, this legal systematization created a new form of dread. Rather than facing the uncertain but potentially quick consequences of earlier periods, late medieval assassins who were captured entered extended judicial processes designed to extract maximum information and establish clear public narratives before carefully staged executions. The psychological burden of this prolonged process, with its inevitably terminal outcome proceeding through predictable stages, represented a unique form of torture beyond the physical methods employed. Throughout the medieval period, assassination existed in complex relationship with warfare and political violence. In some contexts, actions that functionally constituted assassination were reframed as acts of war when conducted against enemy leaders. This ambiguous boundary created situations where similar acts might be treated entirely differently depending on political circumstances and the status of the individuals involved. For assassins themselves, this ambiguity rarely provided practical protection, but occasionally offered psychological rationalization. Historical sources record instances where killers justified their actions as contributions to broader conflicts rather than mere murder for payment. These justifications seem to have provided limited psychological comfort to some assassins, allowing them to position their actions within frameworks of loyalty and service rather than pure criminality. Religious institutions throughout the medieval period maintained complex relationships with assassination. While official doctrine universally condemned murder for hire, actual practice sometimes involved churchmen contracting assassinations for political purposes while publicly denouncing such acts. This hypocrisy created additional moral confusion for religious assassins, who might receive contract offers from the very authorities tasked with condemning their profession. Some assassins attempted to manage this contradiction through elaborate theological reasoning. Historical records include confessions, where killers described developing personal religious frameworks that justified their actions through concepts like divine instrumentality or necessary evil. These rationalizations rarely survived direct confrontation with official religious authorities, but provided temporary psychological accommodation with otherwise irreconcilable contradictions. As we approach the end of the medieval period proper, we see assassination beginning its transition toward its early modern forms. By the late 15th century, the emergence of centralized states created new contexts for politically motivated killing. The declining power of universal religious frameworks allowed new justifications based on emerging concepts of national interest and raison d'etre. Technological developments, particularly early firearms, created new methodological possibilities with different risk profiles. However, these transitions brought little immediate improvement to the assassin's dreadful condition. While the conceptual frameworks surrounding their actions evolved, the practical dangers remained largely unchanged or even intensified. Early firearms, for example, offered greater killing range but were unreliable, difficult to conceal, and created distinctive evidence that made their users easier to identify. The emerging centralized states of the late medieval period developed more sophisticated investigative techniques specifically targeting assassination. The same administrative capacity that allowed these states to collect taxes more efficiently also enabled them to conduct more thorough investigations, maintain better records of suspicious individuals, and coordinate judicial responses across larger territories. For assassins, these developments further narrowed the already slim possibilities for escaping consequences. Throughout all these historical variations, one constant remains clear: choosing or being forced into the role of assassin represented entry into a profession designed to destroy its practitioners. Unlike nearly any other medieval occupation, assassination offered no possibility of security, satisfaction, or legacy. It promised financial reward while virtually ensuring the individual would not survive to enjoy it, offered power that inevitably attracted overwhelming opposition, and required skills that marked their possessors for destruction. The medieval assassins' tragedy lay in this fundamental contradiction. Their value existed precisely in their willingness to take actions that would inevitably destroy them. They were tools designed to break in use, weapons that wounded their wielders as deeply as their targets, instruments valued only until the moment their utility ended. This instrumental status, more than any specific danger or difficulty, represents the most deeply dreadful aspect of their existence. For the medieval person contemplating or being coerced into assassination work, historical examples offered a virtually unbroken pattern of disaster. The profession's successes were measured in days or months of survival, rather than years. Its rewards were theoretical rather than practical, and its end was not a question of if, but when and how badly. In a period where most people defined themselves through stable roles in communities, the assassin represented an anti-identity defined by secrecy, transience, and inevitable destruction. As we conclude this exploration of how the assassin's experience evolved throughout the medieval period, one final aspect deserves attention: the persistent gap between the historical reality of these figures and their later romantic portrayal in literature and popular culture. This gap emerged even during the late medieval period itself, with early literary treatments beginning to transform the universally reviled assassin into a more complex figure, sometimes portrayed with elements of tragic nobility or misunderstood virtue. As we reach the conclusion of our exploration into why it was truly dreadful to be a medieval assassin, let's examine the material culture of this lethal profession, the physical tools, environments, and artifacts that shaped the assassin's experience across different regions and periods. The assassin's tools reflected both the technological limitations of the medieval period and the specific requirements of killing by stealth. Unlike the specialized, purpose-built equipment of modern fiction, medieval assassins typically relied on adapted everyday items that wouldn't attract attention if discovered during searches or random encounters. Daggers represented the most common lethal tool, with certain designs preferred for assassination work. The narrow-bladed misericord, originally designed to deliver mercy kills to wounded knights by penetrating chainmail, proved particularly effective for assassins needing to strike quickly through clothing with minimal resistance. Some regions developed distinctive assassination blades, Italian stilettos, designed for thrusting between ribs, or Eastern curved jambias that maximized internal damage with minimal external bleeding. These weapons created immediate practical problems for their users. Effective assassination daggers required regular maintenance that risked raising suspicion. Sharpening stones, oils, and cleaning materials could attract unwanted attention, especially for individuals whose ostensible professions wouldn't require such tools. Many assassins resorted to maintaining their weapons in remote locations or disguising maintenance materials within legitimate trade goods, adding layers of complication to already dangerous work. Poison presented even greater practical challenges. Effective toxic substances, like arsenic compounds, hemlock, or belladonna, required specialized knowledge to prepare and handle safely. Without modern containment materials, like sealed glass vials or plastic containers, assassins used waxed leather pouches, hollowed coins, or sealed pottery vessels to transport their toxins, all methods prone to leakage that exposed the carrier to their own poisons. The cumulative exposure created distinctive physical symptoms that made experienced poisoners increasingly recognizable to authorities aware of these markers. Historical medical texts describe the poisoner's hands, discolored fingernails, characteristic tremors, and distinctive skin lesions that resulted from regular handling of toxic substances. As careers progressed, poisoners became increasingly likely to be identified by these occupational markers, creating a terrible irony where success led directly to increased recognition risk. Beyond weapons, medieval assassins needed everyday equipment that supported their lethal work while maintaining plausible cover identities. Lock manipulation tools disguised as ordinary household items, climbing equipment hidden within legitimate trade tools, and clothing modified to conceal weapons without visible bulges, all represented adaptations specific to their requirements. This equipment created practical burdens beyond their obvious dangers. Assassins needed to maintain and transport these items without attracting attention, often requiring elaborate hiding methods that limited their mobility and options. The constant concern about discovery of these materials added yet another layer to the already overwhelming vigilance required by their profession. The physical environments where assassins operated presented distinct challenges across different contexts. Court assassins, working within royal or noble households, navigated spaces designed specifically to prevent unauthorized access and movement. Urban assassins operating in medieval cities faced the challenges of close-packed populations where strangers were immediately noticed and remembered. Rural assassins confronted the difficulties of approaching isolated but often self-sufficient targets with limited cover or escape routes. Each environment created specific physical demands on the assassin's body. Court operations required the ability to move silently through interiors designed with security in mind, developing specialized movement techniques that placed unusual strain on muscles and joints. Urban assassinations demanded the stamina to maintain cover activities for extended periods while waiting for opportunities. Rural operations often required long-distance travel under difficult conditions, followed by physically demanding approaches to targeted locations. These physical demands accelerated the bodily deterioration already occurring from stress, exposure to toxic substances, and untreated injuries. The medieval assassin's body typically aged far faster than their chronological years would suggest, with sources describing individuals in their 30s displaying physical characteristics more common to those decades older: stooped posture, joint deformities, neurological symptoms, and reduced physical capabilities. What emerges from this examination of the material culture of medieval assassination is a profession that destroyed its practitioners physically, even when they escaped the more obvious dangers of capture and execution. The very tools and techniques required for their work directly damaged those who employed them, creating a situation where even successful assassins experienced progressive physical deterioration that limited both their professional effectiveness and quality of life. Beyond these practical considerations, the material culture of medieval assassination included the instruments of their inevitable punishment. Specialized execution tools designed specifically for those who killed by stealth, elaborate torture devices, modifications to standard execution methods to increase suffering, and purpose-built display structures for their remains formed part of the visual culture surrounding this profession. These punishment instruments served as constant visible reminders of the fate awaiting discovered assassins. Public squares in many medieval cities featured permanent execution structures, where the remains of executed assassins might be displayed for months or years. These displays served both as general deterrents and specific warnings to others in the profession, creating a visual culture of intimidation that assassins themselves had to navigate while conducting their work. As we complete our journey through the dreadful existence of medieval assassins, the comprehensive nature of their misery becomes clear. Every aspect of their profession, from its practical requirements to its social position, from its economic structure to its spiritual implications, seemed designed to maximize suffering while minimizing reward. The physical tools damaged their bodies, the methods corrupted their minds, the social context isolated their spirits, and the inevitable consequences destroyed their futures. Unlike almost any other medieval profession, assassination offered no path to security, respect, or legacy. It promised rewards it almost never delivered, offered hope it systematically extinguished, and created patterns of destruction that followed predictable trajectories, regardless of individual skill or circumstance. It was, in the most literal sense, a dead end, a path that narrowed inexorably toward capture, torture, execution, and posthumous infamy. For the medieval person contemplating this profession, whether through desperate circumstances, coercion, or rare free choice, historical examples offered an unbroken pattern of disaster that makes the persistent romantic myths surrounding assassins all the more striking. The gap between the historical reality and later cultural representation represents one final injustice to those who lived and died in these truly dreadful circumstances: the erasure of their authentic suffering beneath layers of glamorized fiction. As you drift toward sleep, consider how fortunate we are to live in an era where such desperate choices are no longer necessary for survival, where social safety nets and legal protections, however imperfect, offer alternatives unimaginable to those who found themselves with no option but to kill for hire in the harsh realities of medieval society.